Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 282. And this time I'm going to talk about Yusef Lateef's record from 1964, his first on Impulse, Jazz Round the World. This is a mono pressing from 1972, a reissue, a lovely gatefold with all the nice pictures there of Yusef playing various instruments, plus his bandmates. As I mentioned when I reviewed Eastern Sounds, Lateef is a guy who really is a giant of jazz history in terms of his experimentation, in terms of his influence on all kinds of people, but he tends to be a little bit, if not underrated, at least underappreciated these days. He was a brilliant artist and a great performer. He was extremely well educated. He taught at the university level of music for many years. Although they never played together, he was a major influence on John Coltrane, whom he knew well, and then later on Alice Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders, both in terms of instrumentation and also musical theory. He was schooled in the blues, in bebop, and hard bop, but he had a lifelong interest in what we would now call world music. He never abandoned his traditional musical roots, but he continued all the way through his career to assimilate lots of different global musical traditions in a way which was decidedly distinct from the exotica craze of the late 50s and early 60s, which was kind of about inventing what you thought other cultures sounded like. He was actually interested in hearing what their music was. He was also one of the very first black jazz musicians to convert to Islam in the late 1940s. And this was, perhaps more than for most people, a very profound switch for him. He delved deeply into it. He was very interested in the relationship between knowledge and faith and the articulation of his music in Islam, and this shows up really all the way through his career. This, as I mentioned, is his first record for Impulse, and it's a great entry point to the high points of his career in the 1960s. It's maybe not as heavyweight as some of the other records he made around this time. Flip side is it's short, it's witty, it's enjoyable, it's a great listen. To recall the early story of Yusef Lateef, he was born in Tennessee in 1920, but moves to Detroit with his family and grows up under the name of Bill Evans. He plays in swing orchestras from the late 1930s on, including that of Hot Lips Page, and then in 1948 he moves to Chicago, where he first starts playing with a guy called Sonny Blunt, who of course would soon become Sun Ra. But soon enough he gets picked up by Dizzy Gillespie and joins Dizzy's orchestra. Chicago, of course, at the time was the heart of black Muslim activity in the United States, and while on tour with Dizzy, 20-year-old Bill Evans converts through the Ahmadiyya movement and becomes Yusef Abdul Lateef. For him, what was really important was the role of learning in Islam and its relationship to his music, and this becomes a career theme. What he took from this was that knowledge, musical or otherwise, could not just be kept in your head, it had to be shared in order to achieve higher planes of spirituality. He's very devout in these things, and this ends up informing his whole philosophy. He rejects the term jazz, which he sees as kind of a demeaning throwaway term, and instead he coins and adopts the term autophysiopsychic to describe the music that he composed and played, and he continues in this vein, ultimately getting a PhD in music education in 1975. But back to the late 40s and early 1950s, at this point he's got a young family, he's ping-ponging between Chicago and Detroit and New York. He leaves the Gillespie band, he's trying to make it in New York, but he's not having much success. He's considering quitting, but then one night he's playing with Art Blakey at the Audubon Ballroom, and Charlie Parker comes in, and after the set comes up to him and says, "Yusef, you played great." And this little pat in the back from the great man was all he needed to change his mind, and he decides to really make a go of it. But life didn't get much easier because at the same time in the early 50s his wife Sadie becomes sick, so he has to leave New York and move back to Detroit, which had its own jazz scene, but had to focus on providing for his family, taking care of his kids. He gets a job at Chrysler. As he settles into the music scene, he eventually develops a quintet with some great players actually, Curtis Fuller on trombone, Hugh Lawson on piano, Louis Hayes on drums, and Ernie Farrow on bass. And of that quintet, Lawson and Farrow would be regular guests or members of his quartets and quintets all the way through the mid-1960s. Thinking about Lateef's life in the late 1950s, if you've ever worried about being an underachiever, look away now, because here's a guy who's holding down a job at a car plant, who is recording something like 15 records in a couple of years, who is an imam at his local mosque. He's learning Arab instruments, he's learning Indian instruments, he's learning the oboe, and he's studying with the first oboe chair with the local symphony orchestra. And from that experience, he basically becomes the greatest oboe virtuoso in jazz history. In terms of composition, he begins to apply drones from the Middle Eastern and African context and different styles of percussion in a way which basically anticipates Pharoah Sanders' records a whole decade later. And it's not just musical curiosity, of course, that's driving this, because this is obviously the time of the civil rights movement in the US. It's the time of the wave of decolonization across the European empires. And so there is a very political agenda to the use of African and Middle Eastern and Indian instrumentation. And Lateef might not have been the most vocal anti-colonial spokesperson, but this obviously was not lost on him. Eventually, perhaps inevitably, all this hard work starts to pay off. His children are a bit older, the job at Chrysler is no longer the necessary anchor that it had been, and so in 1960 he decides to leave Detroit and move to New York to really have a go at hitting the big time in jazz. The first serious musical connection he makes when he moves back to New York is with Charles Mingus, and he joins the Jazz Workshop at the same time as Eric Dolphy and Roland Kirk were there, quite a lineup, and he is on one Mingus record, Pre-Bird, from 1960. He leaves Mingus's environment in 1961 and he starts to play for a while with the Nigerian drummer Babatunde Olatunji. In 1962, he then gets recruited by Cannonball Adderley and he stays there for about a year. If you look on YouTube, you can see a clip of the sextet playing on a show called Jazz Scene USA featuring Lateef. He mainly played tenor with the sextet, but Cannonball also allowed him to stretch out on all these other different instruments, which added a ton to the sextet's sound. In terms of Lateef's benefit from that experience, much as his time with Dizzy had been about learning what it meant to truly improvise, his time with Cannonball Adderley touring around basically was his apprenticeship in learning how to run a group. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, in 1963, he leaves Cannonball and starts leading his own groups. He recruits his former sidemen from his Detroit days, Hugh Lawson on piano and Ernie Farrow on bass. His compositional brilliance and his exploration of new sounds by 1963 made him ideal for what was pretty much the most dynamic jazz label around, and sure enough, Bob Thiele signs him for Impulse Records later on that year and heads right into the studio to make this record. Jazz Around the World is made, as the song says, in late December back in '63, the 19th and 20th of December to be precise. Bob Thiele's the producer, and unsurprisingly, Rudy Van Gelder is the engineer. This record has a lot of different instrumentation and a lot of different musical influences. It is not a straightforward hard bop record by any stretch of the imagination, and as such, proves to be a bit controversial. It shouldn't have been, based on Lateef's prior output, but then Impulse Records was a bigger stage than he'd been on before, and so maybe that impact was not surprising. Lateef plays tenor, oboe, bassoon, flute, and shehnai. Farrow's on bass, Lawson's on piano, Richard Williams is on trumpet. He's basically a career sideman. He'd met Lateef through the Jazz Workshop. They were both with Mingus in the early 1960s. Rounding out the band is Lex Humphreys on drums. He'd been on a number of other Lateef records, including Eastern Sounds. His playing, I think, all the way through here is excellent. It's reminiscent of, but not imitative of, Elvin Jones. Side one starts with Habana, which is a snappy little tune. It's basically a blues in form, but Lateef's musical mannerisms show the influence of a whole bunch of different non-Western musical styles. Williams playing here too is excellent. The next track is India, and Lateef, I think, plays the introduction on a shehnai, which is an Indian instrument. This is a fascinating composition. It has what I think are scales based on Indian forms, but there are some clear Middle Eastern and almost Spanish feels here as well. The next track, You, So Tender and Wistful, is the most jazz-like track so far, but it's anything but straight-ahead swinging jazz. Has some real Coltrane-ish and Coleman-ish kinds of influences in the melody. Yusef's French Brother, by contrast, is a piece of real swinging, bluesy hard bop. The final track on side one is the Volga Rhythm Song, which is kind of a fun take on the traditional Russian tune. But the best thing about this track is Humphrey's drumming, which is a total delight. Side two starts with what is probably the best track in the record, the standard Trouble in Mind. And this is the tasty blues oboe solo you didn't know that you needed, but you do. The Good Old Roast Beef of England is, like its title, filling but not that remarkable otherwise. But the next track, Raisin and Almonds, is a complete delight. This is Lateef on flute with just the most subtle accompaniment from the rhythm section. He's also on flute on Utopia, which has Williams on muted trumpet. The last track is a Japanese tune called Ringo Oiwaki, and this is characterized by this repetitive, very high-pitched little pizzicato plucking by Ernie Farrow on bass and by Lateef's very sweeping tenor sound. This isn't a perfect record, but it's a fascinating record. It's full of 3-minute tunes and catchy melodies and interesting instruments. It's almost like a pop record in some ways. But the musical commitment on here is as serious as the playing is brilliant. It's not as profound or as heavyweight as some of the records which Lateef would do later for Impulse and, of course, for Atlantic Records, but it is a great introduction to what I think is the greatest decade of his career, and for me, it's 4 to 5 stars.